Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mariela Colon, and on behalf of everyone at the Chicago Public Library, welcome. Tonight's virtual program is another in our ongoing series of literary, cultural, and civic programming. We are looking forward to sharing tonight's event to our online audience as we continue to bring you Chicago-centric stories. So I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Richard Cahan and Michael Williams do something that few other authors do. They create books out of photo collections. They use pictures to tell stories. They have written more than a dozen critically acclaimed books, many based in Chicago. They have written about architectural preservationist Richard Nickel, recently discovered photographer Vivian Maier, and books from the photo archives of the Metropolitan Sanitary District, Lost Panoramas, the CTA, City on the Move, and 3 books from the Chicago Sun-Times photo collection, Real Chicago Sports, and their new book, Chicago Exposed. We're thrilled to host them tonight on their latest release, which is Chicago Exposed. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our speakers and introduce us to this really exciting new photo collection.
Thanks, Mariella. It's a pleasure for Mike and I to be here. We are Chicago Public Library card members and users, and we very much believe in libraries, and especially the Chicago Public Library. And it's a pleasure to talk about our recent book that's just coming out late this year. It's called Chicago Exposed: Defining Moments from the Chicago Sun-Times Photo Archive. And if you heard Mariella's introduction, you might wonder why we're doing a third book on Chicago. And the answer is that our first 2 books, Real Chicago and Real Chicago Sports, were done in the early 2000s. And the city has grown and it's changed and it has new challenges and problems. And we thought we would revisit it. And we also thought we would bring people, we thought we would connect the pictures to people who could tell the stories behind the pictures. So we talked to the photographers who took the pictures. We talked to the subjects of the pictures. We talked to writers. We talked to historians. We talked to community members to really help explain what these 80 pictures mean, so that we get a really fuller understanding of Chicago in the last 80 years when the Chicago Sun and the Chicago Times were started. The cover of our book is a picture of Mamie Till at the funeral of her son Emmett Till in the 1950s. And we think that the picture is kind of a note to the seriousness of the book. In general, this book is not a book of celebration. It's not a book of skylines or Michigan Avenue. It's an attempt to really look beyond what we call the facade of Chicago, look at neighborhoods, and try to understand our city better in photographs. Mike, what are your thoughts as we start?
Well, I guess we should say this book is done in conjunction with the Chicago History Museum. They recently acquired over 2 million images from the Chicago Sun-Times, and it took kind of an odd route from the Sun-Times to the History Museum. Back in 2009, the Chicago Sun-Times sold its photo archive to a businessman named John Rogers. And this was done because a lot of papers back at that time were starting to feel the stress of the internet age, and they didn't have the resources to keep up and compete with online news, television news. So in an effort to make a little money, they sold their entire photo archive to this businessman in exchange for getting that collection digitized. And believe it or not, he was free to do whatever he wanted to with those pictures. So they wound up on eBay, they wound up in other online auctions. Then we're going to fast forward to 2018. Kind of at the end of that sale, John Russick at the History Museum kind of identified this collection and saw the value. And the remaining images were then bought by the History Museum, and they've had this ongoing process of digitizing and making it available to historians like us and the public. And that's kind of where we came in. We've gotten this opportunity now, as Rich said, to do a second look at this collection after doing these books in 2004. And it's been kind of an exciting journey, and it's really fun to be back working with this material again.
And Mike mentioned John Russick from the History Museum. He wrote the foreword to the book. We're going to go through the book kind of quickly just to give you kind of an insider's back look at the book. He wrote the foreword of the book, and Lee Bay, who is a Chicago Sun-Times editorial writer, wrote the introduction. And we chose Lee because of his background, his longtime association with the Sun-Times, and also because he's a real fan of this photo archive. If you go on his site on Facebook or Instagram, he's oftentimes putting pictures up. He really loves this collection. And the introduction of the book starts with a photograph, one of the most famous photographs of the Sun-Times took. It's a rescue of schoolgirls at the Our Lady of the Angels school fire in 1958 by photographer Bob Kitalik. And Mike, I thought we would just page through the book and stop where we feel like stopping and tell a little bit about each, or not each, but several pictures.
Yeah, sounds great. I guess we should talk a little bit about the background of this collection, first of all. So it's not really just one paper, it's actually parts of 4 papers, because the Sun-Times actually started out as the Chicago Times in 1929, then the Chicago Sun in 1941. Those 2 papers combined together in 1948. And then over the years, the Daily News and the Sun-Times, kind of beginning in the 70s, they shared a photo morgue. And a lot of those pictures got mixed up. So now as part of this acquisition, it really contains elements of all 4 of those papers. And it's an encyclopedic look at Chicago. I don't know how to describe it, other than pretty much any subject you could think of, you'll probably find it within this archive. It's that encyclopedic.
Right. And starting in the 1940s, where this collection starts, the Sun-Times was known as Chicago's picture newspaper. So pictures were very important to the newspaper. So I think if there was one newspaper that we would like to use as kind of a background of a photo history of Chicago, it certainly would be the Sun-Times. I started working there as a picture editor in 1983, and I worked there till 2000. And I actually met Mike. Mike was a photographer who photographed the Granada Theater and brought in some photographs that we ended up not using, but it was a great meeting.
Yeah, it really triggered my love because you took me on a tour of the photo library. And from then on, it was always my goal to make it back there. And of course, this is our 3rd book. So,
well, who would have ever guessed that we'd spend the next 20 years back in the photo library?
Yeah. So
the book is basically chronological. And we start, the first picture we show is a very famous picture, actually, not by the Sun or the Times. I mean, it was actually by the Sun, and it was taken by Bory Cantor. It's probably the most famous picture of the early newspaper. It's a picture of Wendell Willkie, who was struck by an egg while he was campaigning in Chicago. Remember, this is 1941, and he's running for president against FDR, and he came to Chicago, and the Sun put the photograph on the front page and had a wonderful editorial. The title was "It Shouldn't Happen Here." And that's really the beginning of this kind of gritty photo policy that the Sun and the Times had. And to find out information about this picture, we actually tracked down Bory Cantor's granddaughter, who told us more about her grandfather and what kind of photographer he was. Mike, you want to talk about these pictures?
Well, let's go up to the VJ Day picture.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so these are pictures from World War II or right around World War II. These are Black troops returning to Chicago. And this is a picture of VJ Day in 1945 that Mike can explain.
Yeah, so what we tried to do is pair pictures together that had kind of a similar subject or a relationship. So here, on the left, we got a picture of a serviceman who's been blinded during the war, who's coming back to the city, photographed at Union Station. And then there on the right, we've got a scene probably in the heart of the Chicago Loop, maybe State and Madison, of people celebrating on VJ Day. This was the official end of the war. And it's interesting, this picture of Bill Sturm, he's one of my favorite photographers because he was one of these guys who he loved to set up dramatic lighting. He loved to take very formal pictures. And this kind of illustrates how each of the photographers had their own strengths and skills. Some people were better kind of on the street doing spot news. Other guys like Bill Sturm, they used to give him assignments to photograph like the last streetcar or the last steam train coming out of Union Station. So each had their own strengths and weaknesses. And we kind of, as we were going through the collection, looked for pictures that would highlight each of their strengths.
Mike?
Yeah, this is another guy I really like too, Russell Ham. He was a photographer who started back with the Daily News in the teens. He was another guy who came out of pictorialist photography. This was more the artistic side of photography, and then he made a career in photojournalism. And this is another good example too of what I would consider to be the feature end of news photography. These are things where they would run picture pages that would kind of visit different places in the city, like maybe Riverview. And in this case, it was Maxwell Street, the Maxwell Street Market in 1942, where they would do a picture page with lots of different pictures and background on that particular story.
And again, we try to match photographs up with people who are alive now, so they can explain the importance of it. This picture, the text here was written by Tom Palazzolo, who's a very prominent experimental filmmaker, and he's done several movies on Maxwell Street. If you ever saw the movie, the Jimmy Stewart movie, Northside 777, it was actually based on a true story. It was based on a man who was accused of murdering a tavern owner, and the Sun-Times was the paper that really covered it the very best. And this is a picture of the release of the man who was freed really by the work of reporters. And I should say that it wasn't actually Northside 777. The phone number was GRO 1758. This is another picture of the Emmett Till funeral, very famous. This is the funeral where Mamie Till made a very important decision to open up the coffin of her son so that the public could understand what had happened to him. And this is a picture of her at the funeral that's used on page 1, and also a picture of crowds arriving at the Roberts Temple Church of God, which is still very much in Chicago and a Chicago landmark, and a crowd that lasted for 5 days.
Okay, these are two examples of what we call spot news. So back in the 40s and 50s, it was not unusual for newspapers to kind of place reporters and photographers around the city, kind of in cars waiting for news to happen, and then race to the scene. So here on the left, we've got a picture of a fireman who is returning to the scene of a CTA accident where his wife was actually killed in this car. And the photographer has captured the moment where he's gone to see where it happened. And then on the right, we have a picture where there's just been an explosion at a factory, and the families are gathering outside waiting for information. And the photographer has captured this moment as the wife is trying to get news. Her husband actually later was found out to be alive. And actually, I brought an example of what the type of camera that was being used back in these days. And as you can see, it is really big, it is really heavy, it is really clunky, and it only has one shot in it. So for photographers back then, unlike today where you have digital cameras where you can take thousands of pictures, these guys only had one chance to get these shots. And as they're muscling in with other photographers and the crowds, you can see how difficult it would be to make these kinds of images. The times have changed a lot since these days.
One of the joys of this project was to look at photographs that might not have been considered important when they were taken, but can seem very important now. This was a little photograph that was inside the Sun-Times in 1959. It's a picture of Native Americans who wanted to welcome a Dutch freighter. It was the first freighter to sail to Chicago through the St. Lawrence Seaway. And it was important for them because they considered this route very much a route that Native Americans established. And they came out and met the ships as they arrived.
Another one of the joys of going through the collection, we're seeing pictures like these expressway pictures. It's the kind of the before and after shots that you'd really hope to find in a collection like this. So here on the left, we got a picture of the Kennedy Expressway being built, just being carved out of a neighborhood. You know, all the buildings and homes and everything have to be literally knocked down as the expressway is built through it. And then over here on the right, we've got a picture of the Congress Expressway taken from the post office building. And you can just see as it plows west towards the suburbs, how all of the industrial buildings and houses and everything were knocked down to make its path.
These are photographs that were taken in the early 1960s by the Sun-Times. They were at civil rights demonstrations. And the photograph on the left was an arrest made by community members who were protesting the use of mobile classrooms. You probably have heard about them. They were called Willis wagons after the Superintendent Benjamin Willis decision in order to make school districts very inequitable. He added classrooms to already overcrowded schools. And we had a chance to track down Rosie Simpson, who was the president of this community organization, who's still alive, and explain the story behind this photograph.
Well, here's a literal before and after picture. What we see here on the left is a picture of the once grand Garrick Theater, designed by Adler and Sullivan. This picture was taken in 1961 when the city was planning to tear it down. So there was a lot of protests. In fact, it was probably one of the first times that the public protested the demolition of a building here in America. And unfortunately, the protest didn't pay off, because the picture here then on the right is the parking garage that replaced the Garrick Theater. And again, this archive has got lots of views of the city that show it grow and change over the years.
This picture on the right is probably one of the most important photographs that Sun-Times took. It was taken by Larry Nocerino in 1966 when Martin Luther King led a group of people through Marquette Park to protest protest housing conditions, and in the hope that open housing would be adopted. And King was stoned while he set foot in the park. One slightly confusing part of this picture is that the man on the left who's holding King's head down is actually a plainclothes policeman. So we don't want you to think it was anything different. He was protecting King after he was hit by stones.
These are two pictures that were taken in the Uptown neighborhood. And as you get into the 1960s, you start to see this, I guess you could call it almost advocacy photojournalism, where the paper would send out photographers to different parts of the city, to say Skid Row on the west side, and in this case to Uptown, to take pictures of living conditions, to show kind of where there's need in the city for things to be improved. And in this case, they sent Jack Dykinga out to Uptown to take these pictures. And then they sent him back about 6 months later to see how things had changed. And this is a way that a newspaper can really act as a catalyst for change in many cases through these really dramatic pictures like you see here. So as you can see, we've just seen a number of pictures taken in 1968. And I think Rich will agree that the photographers for the Sun-Times and the Daily News really did incredible work during this period. There was so much going on in 1968. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy and the reaction to that in Chicago. Then you had the Democratic Convention in August, and that's what you see here. A picture of an ironic sign being held by a protester outside the Conrad Hilton, "Welcome to Chicago." And there was so many iconic pictures that were taken in 1968 by the newspaper staff. And in many ways, they were showing the whole world what was happening in Chicago. And I think, again, this was a period when photographers were not just recording the news, but they were making news, because they were showing the injustices, they were showing the overstepping bounds by the police. And I think in that way, I think when we would look through this material, we really thought you could do almost an entire book on 1968. There were so many powerful, iconic images, like this one by Dwayne Hall.
Absolutely. And when we asked Dwayne Hall to write about this, and he left the Sun-Times in 1977, and he looked back at this period and he wrote, "These were the glory days of photojournalism. I never thought it would end." These are other pictures from 1968. This is from inside the Democratic National Convention. This is the Battle of Chicago. This is protesters confronting National Guardsmen during that big convention week. And so many things, as Mike said, kind of corresponded in 1968. This picture, I think, was a little bit of a shock. This is Alabama Governor George Wallace, who was running for president. And this is him being paraded down State Street. And of course, it's surprising to see the support that he got. Journalist Deborah Douglas, who used to work for the Sun-Times, wrote a piece about this. We asked her to react. She's an African-American writer, and she ended her piece by saying, "For white society, this photo evokes the question, is this your king?" So there was busing. There was the beginning, really, of Black Power. There was the starting of the very powerful movement of young lords and Cobra Stones and Black Panthers and Young Patriots and protest. And then we returned in the book because of this, everything's kind of falling on top of each other. A year later was the start of the Chicago 8 trial.
Yeah, this is an example of a picture that, because this famous trial it was just made into a movie recently, and you could see all of the dramatic action happening in court. Photographers weren't allowed inside the courtroom, so they were left just to record the kind of circus-like atmosphere that was going on outside the federal building. And that's what you see here, this kind of candlelight protest. And then, of course, Abby Hoffman there on the right, who would always provide photographers with something juicy to photograph with the kind of wild stunts that he would do.
And a lot of these pictures are events that were very public. And some of these pictures are events that were not so public, especially to white Chicago. These are protests. If you take a look at the top left pictures, these are protesters in the Contract Buyers League. And they were protesting the very unfair mortgage arrangements on the west side and the south side for African Americans. Oftentimes, if they missed one payment, they would not be late. They would lose whatever they had into the purchase of their homes. And finally, in the 1970s, they really rose up to protest. And the force against them, as you can see from this picture, was pretty massive. These are pictures from the 1969 Fred Hampton shooting. These are two state senators inspecting the bed where Hampton was killed in December of 1969. We think that this is an essential event in Chicago history. And Bobby Rush, who co-founded the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, wrote perhaps the most important piece about his views on Fred Hampton, about the police, and about how this event changed Chicago and made it possible for Harold Washington to become mayor, and made it possible eventually for Barack Obama to become president.
So now we go up to 1971, and this is a really important series of photographs taken by Jack Dakinga, and he won the Pulitzer Prize that year for taking these pictures. He was sent downstate to Lincoln, Illinois and Dixon, Illinois, where there were some state-run schools for developmentally challenged kids. And the parents of these children were really concerned about the living conditions there. And at the time, the then Governor Ogilvy was actually thinking about cutting back on funding to these institutions. So Dakinga went down with a few reporters, and what he saw was sad and tragic, and he was deeply affected by it. And he writes alongside here in this really wonderful piece about how when he first started to photograph, he just couldn't do it. He was so disturbed, but he got himself together and he created this powerful set of pictures that so moved the state and the governor that the funding was reinstated. And it just kind of shows, again, the power of photojournalism to change minds and to change lives. And that's what you see here in these pictures.
Mayor Daley's funeral, the L crash in 1977. And this picture on the left was published in the paper, but somehow it's never been considered one of the most important pictures in Sun-Times history, and I think it really was. It was a march of supremacists, and an African-American man got into the march, and he was saved by these two men. You can see this man in sunglasses in the middle, and there's a man with a mustache right behind him. And he was pulled out of the march as he was being beaten. And interestingly, the caption at the time in the Sun-Times said that they were just people who were standing by, do-gooders. But I think since then, I think it seems clear to me there were many plainclothes policemen, and I believe that they were probably Chicago policemen who had waded into the march, because you can tell from the other marchers that they weren't just people that would normally be in the middle of a march. And I think it's a really important picture. It was taken by James Dupree, who just passed away a few months ago, and his son, Matthew, helped us understand the picture better because his father had left audio tapes about his years with the Sun-Times. The Sun-Times' most important project of its history probably is the project looking at corruption in city agencies. They started a bar called the Mirage in 1977, and they literally ran an authentic bar and recorded every interaction that city officials had to try to document shakedowns and different how they were treated as businessmen. And it was a long running series that came close to winning the Pulitzer Prize. And this is a picture taken by Jim Frost. And this is a fire inspector who arrived to survey the Mirage, and how he was involved in this whole secret series. It was a 25-part series that ran for weeks and really made Chicago take note of the importance of journalism.
This is a picture of John Wayne Gacy, the notorious killer. It might even, in fact, be the first picture taken of him as a suspect. Yeah, it's a picture that Richard Dirk took. He was sent over to this house on Summerdale. At that time, news was very slow moving. It's not like today where things go very fast and we get information transferred very quickly. So he was sent to the scene. He saw policemen coming out with bags of evidence. Then all of a sudden, a policeman told him that they might have a suspect they're bringing by. So the car quickly went through. Dirk took some images, not really knowing what he got or who he got. And it wasn't until later when he got back to the newsroom when reporters confirmed that, yeah, that was a suspect, John Gacy. And it really does illustrate how these guys have to just kind of work in the dark often, how they had to photograph whatever they saw, not knowing if it's the thing that they needed or if it would be something that would just be thrown away. But this iconic image came out of those circumstances. Really powerful picture.
This is Mayor Byrne and Free Green. The crash of Flight 191. And this is Disco Demolition night.
So this is a picture, I think, for those who haven't heard about it, Disco Demolition was this radio stunt gone horribly bad. It was organized by Steve Dahl, a disc jockey at WLUP. They blew up some records during the in-between time between a doubleheader, and a riot ensued. Bonfires were being burned in the infield. And this great photograph by Jack Lenahan. I like this view because so many of the views were taken from the press box or from the stands. Here he comes right down onto the field, and you can kind of get this rioter view of what was happening. Again, a really iconic image.
And we showed you pictures of Jack Dykinga. He won the first Pulitzer Prize in photography for the Daily News and Sun-Times. And John H. White won the second. And it was a series of photographs that they called feature photographs. And some of them, much of them was life inside and outside the Robert Taylor homes. And White worked for the Sun-Times for over 3 decades for the Daily News and the Sun-Times, and was really the soul of the newspaper during the years that I worked there, and so many people worked there. This is a picture of Harold Washington's inauguration. And what makes this picture so wonderful is the glance, the mood of Jane Burns, the former mayor who lost to Washington, standing on the right. She's trying to be dignified, but in this one brief moment, her emotions show as Harold Washington is inaugurated as mayor. And this is a view of Harold Washington's funeral in City Hall. And it's interesting, the photographer went around 3 in the morning and expected that he would be you can see the clock in the picture, 2:45, and he expected he would be the only person in City Hall at that hour. And what he found was the vestibules were packed with people, and he used a slow shutter speed so he could show the people walking through past the casket. So these are photographs from the early 90s of the remarkable demonstrations by the group ACT UP, who were protesting poor health care that were offered by the victims of AIDS. And they had these massive demonstrations all over Chicago. And it was actually written by one of the demonstrators, Owen Keenan, who recalls how important these demonstrations were for people for gay people, because they gave them a voice. That's why we call this, he wrote, street activism was scream therapy. It was important for them to get on the street and really voice their feelings. And it was very effective, obviously.
So we wrapped up the book by focusing on the last 20 years. The papers switched over to color during the 1990s. It then became a digital paper with digital photography beginning in the early 2000s. It kind of changed the nature of photography, because back in the old days when it was black and white, you kind of had different types of images needed to be used that were strong and could be printed in just those two colors of black and white. Now you can look at these pictures here and show the richness of color, and it becomes like a whole new way to show news photography. The pictures here of Barack Obama, that picture that was up there in the top corner was this neat little find of when Obama was running for Congress against Bobby Rush, an election he lost. But of course, here we are in 2008, on election night after he's just won the election. So there's lots of little images found in this collection that when they were taken, you wouldn't understand the significance. But of course, today you do see the significance.
And these are pictures from the Sun-Times third Pulitzer Prize that related to photography. John J. Kim photographed homicide detectives as they tried to piece together, as they tried to solve cases. And obviously last year, 2020, was an essential year in Chicago and Chicago history. And these are photographs from the demonstrations around the city and the lootings that were around the city. Mary Mitchell, who's a Sun-Times columnist, wrote about it and its impact on Chicago and how it changed the city. And our final picture is a photograph of a nurse, and she's taking a break during her rounds of taking care of COVID patients. And this was taken in April of 2020, so it was about a month into the changing of our world, the COVID era. And the photographer spent a day with this nurse, and this was just a moment where the nurse collected her thoughts and went on from there. So we hope that this collection gives people another look at the last 80 years of Chicago. And for some of us, this is our history. I mean, for all of us, some of us go back 80 years, some of us go back 40 years, but there's something so amazing about photojournalism. It's a time capsule that lets us relive the past and helps us understand who we are. And not only is it a time capsule, it gives other people a chance to reflect on the city and about the times.
Yeah, I think that's the amazing thing about these newspaper archives, that going all the way back to the 1940s, a staff of, somewhere between 10 or 14 people went out every day and photographed the life of the city, the events of the city, the sports, the news, the weather, every aspect of it. And it's like a time capsule of those days. And to have this collection now in a public museum where people can come with all different interests and find so much of the city's history recorded it's amazing. And it's a real gift to the city, what these photographers have given us.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Richard and Michael, for this comprehensive history of Chicago photo collection. Each photo really presents such an important part of Chicago, and it really introduces so many stories that might have been lost otherwise, or it shows how photos are such a powerful storytelling device, and that's something we really deal with at the library. We really want to highlight everyone's story and get the complete picture of where we are today. So that is all the time we have this evening. Signed copies of Chicago Exposed can be purchased directly from City Files Press, a Chicago-based publishing company, at cityfilespress.com. Tonight's program will be available on the Chicago Public Library YouTube page. If you know of people who would be interested but were unable to join us this evening, please invite them to watch it on demand. And please visit the Chicago Public Library website for many more upcoming virtual events at chipublib.org. Thank you very much, panelists, and thank you, audience, for joining us. Have a great night and stay well.